I'll be speaking with Yasser Munif. He's a professor of sociology at Emerson College and active in the global campaign for solidarity with the Syrian revolution. He's the featured speaker at a program this Saturday evening in New Haven, a program entitled Grassroots Struggles in Syria and Iran. And we're going to do a very short interview touching about certain things in Syria. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Perhaps we could talk about the death of one man there's so many terrible things going on, but it seemed to have struck a chord, and many people are talking about this man, Abdulbaset al-Sarout. Can you tell about him?
Yeah, so Abdulbaset Sarout was one of the icons of the Syrian revolution, and he was a famous player, soccer player, in the Homs team. And when the protest started, very quickly he defected and started protesting and leading some of the demonstration. And he had a very distinctive voice, and he used to sing at the funerals. And very quickly the Syrian regime tried to kill him, assassinate him, and he became one of the leaders of the Syrian revolt, formed his own brigade and resisted the Syrian regime in Homs. And he faced one of the most brutal campaigns against Homs back in 2012, when the Syrian regime wanted to almost showcase or teach the rebels a lesson when he destroyed an entire neighborhood, Baba Amro, and massacred many civilians, and almost the entire brigade he was part of, and 4 of his brothers were killed. And from that moment on, he's been always at the forefront, fighting the Syrian regime. And his trajectory was not linear. At some point, he joined some of the more radical groups, including Al-Qaeda, but then he left them because of he saw their real treatment and the way they were crushing the revolution in a certain way. And so when he left them, they tried to kill him, assassinate him, and he was finally fighting with the Syrian opposition outside those jihadist brigades, and he was killed at the front in Idlib a few days ago.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So Idlib is one of the last places not under total control by Assad, and what is he doing there? He's pounding it, right?
Yeah, so the Assad regime early on, I think since 2013, has been displacing population and removing civilians from besieged areas and moving them to Idlib. And so the Syrian regime was parking a lot of its opponents, whether civilians or different military brigades, in Idlib. And he transformed that region into the last island, or the last region where there is still opposition to the regime. And he also sent a lot of jihadists and fundamentalists, and that's why this region has a lot of different, quite radical brigades, but also many revolutionary and opposition fighters. And 6 or 7 months ago, there was some kind of agreement between the Russian on the one hand and the Turks that this is a safe zone, and they created a buffer zone between the Syrian regime and that area to prevent the regime from taking it over and massacring the population. But the regime obviously wants to be done with that rebellion and wants to take back that region, and started a very aggressive, violent campaign almost 6 or 7 weeks ago. And so they want to take it back.
And
so
Turkey hasn't said anything, hasn't done anything.
Yeah, Turkey is really using it as a bargaining chip. And so Turkey is more interested in the northern areas at its border, where the Kurds are very active and control the territory. And so Turkey is using that region, Idlib, as a bargaining chip with the Russian. And so a few months ago, they got Afrin, and they gave the Russian and the Syrian south of Idlib, north of Hama, a part of that region that is the front right now. Turkey doesn't really care much about Idlib. Turkey cares more about what is happening at the borders and what's happening with the Kurds.
Now, I understand you're going to talk a bunch about prisoners, which is, Amnesty International comes out with terrible reports every once in a while, but the issue is not that much in the public view. But then there was this article in the New York Times that was quite big, quite startling and thorough, and you're going to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the prison system in Syria has been one of the pillars of the Syrian regime for very, very long time. And the Syrian regime has used it to crush any kind of opposition for 5 decades now. The leftist leader, Riyad al-Turk, has described Syria as the kingdom of silence, referring to the prison system where any kind of opposition or any kind of opponents to the Syrian regime is thrown in the jail, oftentimes tortured and killed. And so in order to understand the nature of the system, I think it's important to really look and examine what's happening in the prison system. Although it's very difficult to get any kind of reports or kind of information from inside. The Syrian regime tries very hard to prevent the leaking of any information. So it was able to create this subterranean world where torture is still ongoing and has been increasing recently. The Syrian regime is trying to get rid of any kind of opposition so that no protest starts after it finishes crushing the revolt.
Do you have any idea of how many people are still in the prisons? How many political prisoners?
There are no precise numbers, but some human rights organizations have described or given different numbers. Some have said that there are at least 120,000 people. Many
Wow.
of them are disappeared. Parents and relatives and friends oftentimes don't know if their relatives are still alive or not. And they don't really know where they are, in which part of this archipelago they are.
I'm sorry, I interrupted your thought.
Yeah, there is like a different type of prisons. So in order to punish harshly some of the leaders and especially the peaceful protesters, the Syrian regime uses the most brutal prison, which is Sednaya, more recently after the destruction of the Palmyra prison by ISIS in 2015.
Well, this is going to be fascinating on Saturday, so I really appreciate this interview. And for those who might attend, it's going to be at the Parish House of the United Church on the Green, 323 Temple Street in New Haven, just 2 buildings away from the big public library. Thank you again for talking.
Thank you.